Richmond Wreck is something of a mystery. Judging by her appearance, I would guess that she was built as a coastal freighter during the interwar years and was apparently sunk to form a breakwater.
Vote for this.
That's how I described the Richmond Wreck in my first video on the California shipwrecks. A mystery. A massive wreck, but one without a name or a past. Clearly she had once had a name. Sailors had once walked her decks and stood watch as she sailed the seas. But time had been unkind to her, and now she lies forgotten and invisible beneath one of the busiest roads in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's been over half a decade since I first discovered this wreck, but finally, I can tell her story. There are many ways to hunt for shipwrecks. Books and historical accounts are an excellent source, as are government reports and databases. Diving and ship spotting websites often have pointers to wrecks, as do sites like Virtual Globetrotting and Atlas Obscura. Despite the plethora of resources, I've long found that simply cruising around Google Earth is one of the most fruitful means for finding wrecks. You simply set the eye altitude to about 700 feet and follow the shoreline looking for boat-shaped objects. The year was 2012, and I was preparing for a trip to California with Leslie. We were both very into kayaking at the time and planned to spend as much time in the water as possible that trip. I was using my available spare time to search areas around where we would be staying when I stumbled upon the Richmond Wreck. It was clearly a shipwreck, and a fairly large one. Historical imagery showed that she had been there for many years, and may not be the only wreck on the site. How was this possible, though? How could a wreck that large be left that close to a major roadway in the Bay Area without someone demanding its removal as an eyesore or environmental hazard? Could it really still be there? My curiosity aroused. The Richmond Wreck, as I had now dubbed her, became one of the highest priority targets for our 2012 trip. When we arrived in California that October, one of the early trips we made was to drive out and try to get a look at her. It became apparent that despite her proximity to the Richmond Bridge, or actually because of it, she was nearly invisible to drivers. The wreck was below the line of sight of people driving on the freeway, and there was no good road access to the shoreline where she lay. In fact, we had to go several miles north to even find a place to access the water. The best we could do on that occasion were these photos taken from over a mile away. At least now, I knew she was real. A couple of days later, we returned to that distant shore access and paddled the 2 miles out to the wreck. There she was, bow standing proudly out of the water, despite having been chopped off at the chain locker. A single flat deck sloped aft into the seas, portholes offering tempting glances into her bowels. The deck was rusted away at the waterline, victim of years of surf pounding against her hull. Further aft, a single deckhouse stood proud from the water, hatchways intact. The water was choppy, and it was impossible to determine where her stern might lie or how deep it might be. This was the early days of my adventuring in boats. I didn't yet have things like GoPros or Cinepoles, nor did I have the skills or confidence to paddle inside the wreck. We explored some of the artifacts in the area, and then began the long, wet paddle back to the truck. We had seen the wreck, touched it in fact, but were no closer to learning her secrets. Back home, I checked the resources I had for more information, but they were silent. The chart noted a visible wreck in that location, but the Automated Wrecks and Obstructions Information System, or AWIS, had no information on it. Out of a desire to give back to a source that had helped me find several desirable sites, I posted the location and pictures to Virtual Globetrotting and left it at that. The trail had gone cold. 5 years later, I got an email saying that someone had commented on my Virtual Globetrotting post. An anonymous commentator indicated the wreck was a former Coast Guard cutter, a sister ship to the USS Potomac. The Potomac I was at least aware of. She had served as President Franklin Roosevelt's yacht during World War II and allowed him to entertain visitors and heads of state from his wheelchair away from the press. It wasn't hard to find photos of the Potomac, but seeing the family resemblance was quite a bit more difficult. Both had round portholes, which were common in ships of that era, and both had a single continuous deck. Notably absent was any sign of the Richmond Wreck's deckhouse on the Potomac. The yacht was quoted as being 165 feet long, and while it was impossible to determine the length of the wreck with any accuracy, this number at least seemed plausible. I was left unconvinced and didn't follow up on it any further. It's only been recently that I've come back to this mystery. Once again, I'm planning a trip to California to kayak and explore wrecks, and I felt it would be worth another look at this one. The poster on Virtual Globetrotting said the wreck was a sister ship to the Potomac, so that should narrow it down. The Potomac was originally built in 1934 as the Coast Guard cutter Electra, one of 18 vessels of the Thetis class, built at various shipyards between 1931 and 1934. After only 2 years in Coast Guard service, the Electra was transferred to the U.S. Navy, extensively modified, and commissioned as the USS Potomac. With the outbreak of World War II, the entirety of the Coast Guard was absorbed into the Navy, and the Thetis class, reshuffled into mostly alphabetic order, became the Argo class of patrol boats assigned the designations of WPC 100 through 116. These ships served honorably throughout the war and were responsible for the sinking of 2 U-boats during the Battle of the Atlantic. After the war, they were sold off, many for scrap, and disappeared from view. If the Richmond Wreck was indeed one of these former cutters, then maybe I could at least narrow the list down some. 18 vessels at least seemed like a more reasonable prospect than hundreds, and though I wasn't still completely convinced that this wreck was a Thetis. Still, I began working down the list. First off, I knew the Electra had become the Potomac and was now berthed nearby at Jack London Square in Oakland, California. 5 of the cutters, Argo, Calypso, Nike, Perseus, and Triton, were sold to the Circular Line, a New York sightseeing company, and remained in service almost 90 years after their construction. Three more were sold to the Navy of the Dominican Republic. Thetis became the Rafael Atoa, then later the Libertad. Icarus became the Independencia, and Galeta became the Restoration. All are believed to have been sunk or scrapped in 1992. I was surprised to learn that I actually had a bit of history with one of these wrecks myself. I found this picture of the Atalanta and immediately recognized the location as being Tai Marina on the Heilbos Waterway in Tacoma. I paddled there a number of times, and reading through my many pictures discovered a picture of her stripped hull. The marina has a number of surplus government vessels in its breakwater, and these will be the subject of a future video. 2 more of the cutters are now part of artificial reefs on opposite coasts. The Cayenne was sold and renamed the Ruby E, but was soon seized for smuggling on the west coast. She was stripped for use as a reef off San Diego, but when they attempted to sink her, she refused to go down. Her prior owners had welded large hidden compartments that acted like air tanks, and the vessel refused to sink until these were blown open. The Nemesis settled in Florida and was converted into a floating restaurant called the Ancient Mariner. When the restaurant folded, the vessel, now in poor condition, was purchased by a local dive club and sunk as a reef. The Pandora and Eridan are believed to have been scrapped. That left just 4. Finally, in the dark corners of the net, on a website last updated in 2003, I found my answer. The site was called US Coast Guard Lightshipsailors.org and had a detailed disposition list of the Thetis-class cutters. The information matched what I had found on other sites for other vessels of the class, and listed one of the cutters sunk as a breakwater in Richmond, California. Finally, after 6 years, the wreck had a name: USS Hermes. The Hermes was built at Bath Iron Works in Maine, with her keel being laid down on January 21, 1931. She was launched a month later on February 23rd and commissioned on March 7th. Despite her East Coast heritage, she appears to have spent almost her entire career in the Pacific. In 1936, she was involved in the rescue of the burning tanker American Fisher off the California coast. I haven't been able to find much information on her wartime service, but it seems to have been focused on search and rescue operations in the Pacific. Later in her career, she was involved in the rescue and attempted salvage of a Martin Mariner seaplane in August of 1946. In 1948, she was decommissioned in Honolulu, Hawaii, and towed across the Pacific to Alameda, California for eventual disposal. Here she remained for a decade until she was sold to the Lerner Company, a scrap metal dealer in Oakland, California. Her superstructure and machinery were scrapped, and the remains of her hull sunk as part of a breakwater protecting a ferry landing. So what are the other 3 Thetis-class cutters? Their fate remains a mystery. The Aurora is believed to have become a private fishing vessel of the same name. The Daphne was sold to a Mexican company for use as a tugboat and may still be operating. Finally, the Dione spent some time as an oilfield survey vessel, underwent several name changes, and is believed to have been cut down to a barge around 1990. She, too, may still be out there. Thank you for joining me on this tale of the USS Hermes and her sisters. I plan to be doing more videos like this on the history of specific wrecks, and I hope you'll join me. Let's go have an adventure.